This morning I want to talk about how to build a common table expression. And in several of my previous videos, I've done common table expressions because they are a lot quicker to use than temp tables. One quick note just to say is that I haven't actually shown how to do it. So I realize that there might be some people that are like, huh, what are you doing with that? So I'm just going to go over the syntax, and this is going to be a quick just how-to video. The first thing is, with a common table expression, you can kind of pick any name you want. You could technically pick a name like this with C as, and then put things in the parentheses. So you can pretty much choose whatever you would like to do in your common table expression as far as the name right there. And I'm going to check really fast on my tables and see which tables I want to use, or which table I want to use. Let's do historical data. So let's select star from historical data. And then let's select star from C. One second, this might actually be on a different schema. Yes, it is. Okay. So technically, if I were to select star from historical data, I would get the same thing. I'm selecting star from the common table expression. So of course, some people might be like, okay, then what's the purpose of a common table expression? Well, kind of think of a temp table. We populate a certain set of data, and it may have like several joins, or it may be certain values. And in the case of values, if you're inserting values into a table, it might actually be faster and easier to use a temp table. But if you're inserting data into a temp table that comes from a query from other tables, depending on how much we're talking about, it might actually be faster and more efficient to use a common table expression. So, as a case in point, we're going to look at this table in just a second, and we will say that we actually only want to look at just the price. And you'll notice that we can select out the price. Another example, let's use another table. Select star from trading. You'll see that, okay, we were selecting star from the table, but we can also add columns on to our common table expression. So this table doesn't have an ID, so let's make an ID. And we'll do row number over order by trading date. Now here's one quick point. If I do this and I run it, it'll give me an error, and it'll say no column name was specified for column 1 of C. Okay, so we're going to give it a name, ID. So now we took everything that was in trading table, we added a column using this common table expression. So some of the things we can do, for instance, we could call this, common table expression, right? Oops, and we also have to adjust that here. We can name it to anything we want. We can name it to weird table, and then put it here. We could also take this subset of data, and if we had another table, we could join it on that other table's data. So again, the big things about a common table expression is that in most situations, not all, but in most situations where people use a temp table that I've seen, especially junior mid developers, you could actually use a common table expression to populate a data set. You'll see actually people populate a temp table and insert, for instance, row number, and then go back and add on a column to the table and then update it where the ID equals this. And they do this entire process with the temp table, with an insert statement, or an update statement, I'm sorry, and adding a column onto the table where you could do something actually as simple as this. And so it can be a huge time saver. And then the other advantage, as well, is if you're dealing with like small sets of data and you have one join, it might actually be much more effective to use a common table expression than populating a temp table. Populating a temp table is very useful if you reuse that data set and you do a lot of joins and you have a huge where clause. Yes, of course, sortability. Yes, of course, using indexes. The advantages of temp tables are amazing. But if it's just like one and you're talking about, maybe 1,000 or so rows of data, it might actually be much more effective to use a common table expression. And then if you look at some of the former videos when it comes to like removing duplicates This makes it very easy to do without using tools like loops. You can also use a common table expression to get like the next, what was it, the next day's value or the previous day's value, like a previous video I've done. And then the other video that I shot, which I think is right before this one, is we're sitting there and we're looking for how to find streaks, sequential streaks. And again, we use a common table expression. So a lot of times you'll see this as a way of shortening the amount of code used versus using temp tables where there's a lot of different processes going on.